At 1:23 a.m. on a quiet spring night in Soviet Ukraine, a routine safety test went wrong. Within 90 seconds, the worst nuclear accident in human history would begin. But to understand how a single failed test could destroy an entire city, we need to go back to the afternoon before, when nobody in Pripyat had any idea their lives were about to change forever. This is the story of Chernobyl, hour by hour. April 25th, 1986, started like any other day in Pripyat. This was not some forgotten industrial outpost. Pripyat was one of the Soviet Union's model cities, built specifically to house the workers of the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant and their families. With an average age of just 26, it was one of the youngest cities in the entire USSR. Wide tree-lined avenues, modern apartment blocks, a cultural palace, swimming pools, and a brand new amusement park with a Ferris wheel that hadn't even opened yet, scheduled for May Day, just 6 days away. Roughly 50,000 people called this city home, and most of them worked at, or had a family member working at, the power plant just a few kilometers away. The plant itself was a source of pride. Reactor number 4 was one of 4 operating reactors at the site, with 2 more under construction. Soviet nuclear technology was presented to the world as the safest and most advanced on the planet. The workers who operated it weren't reckless amateurs. Many were skilled engineers who had spent years training for exactly this kind of work. On the surface, everything about this place said competence, progress, and control. That evening, the night shift was preparing to run a test that had been attempted, unsuccessfully, 3 times before. It was a safety experiment, ironically enough, designed to answer a question that had been nagging at Soviet nuclear engineers for years. If the plant lost external power, would the residual spin of the turbine generators provide enough electricity to keep the cooling pumps running until the emergency diesel generators kicked in? It sounds technical, and it was, but the goal was simple. They wanted to close a dangerous gap in the plant's safety systems. The irony, which nobody could see at the time, is that the test meant to make the plant safer is what destroyed it. The test had been scheduled for earlier that day during the day shift, when the most experienced operators were on duty. But a sudden request from the regional power grid controller delayed it. Kiev needed extra electricity that afternoon, so Reactor 4 had to keep running at full power for several more hours. This single administrative delay meant that the test, originally planned for a well-rested, well-prepared day crew, would now fall to the night shift instead, a team that hadn't trained specifically for this experiment, and that would be running it in the early hours of the morning, the time when human alertness and decision-making are at their lowest. As the clock ticked past midnight into April 26th, the night shift began lowering the reactor's power output to prepare for the test. This is where things started to go wrong, slowly, almost invisibly at first. An operator failed to properly adjust a control system, and the reactor's power dropped far lower than intended, plunging into a state nuclear engineers call the iodine pit, a temporary buildup of a neutron-absorbing byproduct that makes a reactor extremely difficult to control at low power. Instead of pausing the test, which protocol technically allowed, the crew made a decision that would prove catastrophic. They pulled out most of the reactor's control rods, the very devices designed to slow down or stop a nuclear reaction, in an effort to bring power back up and keep the experiment moving forward. By around 1 a.m., the reactor was in a configuration that violated nearly every safety guideline in the plant's own operating manual. Far too few control rods remained inserted. The reactor had become unstable, twitchy, prone to sudden and unpredictable surges in power. The operators in the control room had no way of fully seeing this. Critical information about just how compromised the reactor's safety margins had become simply wasn't visible on their instruments in a way anyone could properly interpret in real time. At 1:23:04 a.m., the test began. The turbine was disconnected from the steam supply to see how long it would keep spinning on its own momentum. Almost immediately, the situation inside the reactor core started to deteriorate. As the turbine slowed, coolant flow through the reactor dropped, and the reactor, already unstable, began generating more and more power in response. A vicious feedback loop that the operators had no way to stop quickly enough. At 1:23:40, the shift supervisor recognized the danger and ordered an emergency shutdown, pressing the button known as AZ5, designed to fully insert every control rod into the core at once and kill the reaction instantly. Under normal conditions, this button was the ultimate safety net. That night, it became the final trigger of the disaster. Because of a flawed design in the control rods themselves, a design flaw that had existed quietly in this entire class of Soviet reactors for years, inserting the rods caused a brief, localized spike in reactivity before the shutdown could take full effect. In a reactor that was already dangerously unstable, that brief spike was enough. In the span of just a few seconds, power output inside the reactor surged to roughly 100 times its rated capacity. The fuel rods shattered. Steam pressure exploded with a force the reactor's structure was never designed to contain. At 1:23:47 a.m., a massive explosion tore through reactor number 4, blowing the 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid clean off the reactor and straight up through the roof of the building. A second explosion followed seconds later. The graphite moderator inside the reactor core, now exposed directly to open air, ignited, and a fire began that would burn, releasing radioactive material into the atmosphere for the next 10 days. Inside the plant, the scene was one of confusion and disbelief. Alarms blared throughout the facility, but many of the operators in the control room initially refused to accept what their instruments were telling them, because what the instruments were telling them seemed impossible. Soviet reactors, they had been taught, did not explode. Some early reports inside the plant that night insisted the reactor itself was still intact, that what they were seeing was some other kind of failure. It would take agonizing minutes and in some cases hours for plant management to accept that the core had been completely destroyed and was now burning in the open air, spewing radioactive material directly into the night sky. Outside, in Pripyat, residents who happened to be awake or out on their balconies that night noticed something strange. A strange blue-white glow lit up the sky above the plant, beautiful in an eerie way, and many people actually walked outside to get a better look, completely unaware that the light they found so mesmerizing was an active nuclear fire releasing lethal doses of radiation into the air around them. Children played outside the next morning. Couples pushed strollers along the city's wide avenues. Nobody told them anything was wrong, because for the first agonizing hours, even some of the people in charge weren't entirely sure how bad it really was. And those who did know weren't yet willing to say it out loud. The firefighters who responded first were given almost no information about what they were truly walking into. They were told there was a fire at the plant. Nobody warned them about radiation. Many arrived in ordinary uniforms with no protective gear beyond their standard firefighting equipment, and began working to put out flames on rooftops and inside buildings that were saturated with invisible, lethal levels of radiation. Some of these men would be dead within weeks, their bodies destroyed from the inside by acute radiation sickness, a slow and horrific death that no one had warned them they were risking that night. For the next 36 hours, the city of Pripyat continued almost exactly as normal. Soviet authorities, caught between the scale of the unfolding disaster and a deeply ingrained instinct towards secrecy, delayed any official acknowledgement of what had happened. Radiation levels inside the city climbed steadily throughout the day on April 26th, invisible, odorless, and undetectable to anyone without specialized equipment, while life on the surface looked completely undisturbed. Schools held classes, markets opened. The amusement park's Ferris wheel sat finished and ready, just days from its planned opening, never to carry a single rider. It wasn't until the afternoon of April 27th, more than 36 hours after the explosion, that the order finally came down. Evacuate Pripyat. Residents were told it would be temporary, just a few days, enough time to deal with what officials vaguely described as a technical issue at the plant. They were instructed to bring only essential documents and a little food, leaving behind furniture, photographs, pets, and entire lives, believing they would return home within the week. Over 1,000 buses arrived, and in just under 3 hours, an entire city of 50,000 people was emptied out, evacuated to villages and towns kilometers away. None of them would ever live in Pripyat again. The scale of what had actually happened only became clear to the wider world days later, and almost by accident. On April 28th, workers at a nuclear plant in Sweden, more than 1,100 kilometers away, detected unusually high radiation levels on their own clothing as they arrived for their shift. After ruling out a leak at their own facility, Swedish scientists traced the radioactive particles in the atmosphere back to the Soviet Union. Only then, faced with undeniable international evidence, did Soviet authorities issue a brief 18-second statement on state television, acknowledging that an accident had occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. No mention of the scale. No mention of the fire still burning. No mention of the firefighters who were already dying in Moscow hospitals. In the days and weeks that followed, the true scope of the disaster slowly came into focus. Helicopter crews flew hundreds of missions over the burning reactor, dropping sand, lead, and boron in an attempt to smother the fire and absorb radiation, flying so close and so often that many of the pilots received dangerous radiation doses themselves. Hundreds of thousands of so-called liquidators, soldiers, miners, engineers, and ordinary citizens were eventually mobilized from across the Soviet Union to help contain the disaster, clearing radioactive debris, building the massive concrete and steel structure that would come to be known as the sarcophagus, and burying entire villages too contaminated to ever be lived in again. An exclusion zone roughly 30 kilometers in radius was established around the plant, an area considered too dangerous for permanent human habitation. It still exists today, nearly 4 decades later. Pripyat itself, once a vibrant city of 50,000 people with an average age of 26, now stands frozen exactly as it was left that afternoon in April. Apartment buildings stand empty, their windows broken, nature slowly reclaiming the streets. The Ferris wheel that never opened still stands in the amusement park, rusted now, one of the most haunting images connected to the entire disaster, a monument to a celebration that never got to happen. The human cost of Chernobyl is still debated and studied today. The immediate death toll from the explosion and acute radiation poisoning in the weeks that followed was relatively small, but the long-term consequences, increased cancer rates among those exposed, the psychological toll on hundreds of thousands of displaced people, and the economic devastation across an entire region are measured in the hundreds of thousands of lives altered, if not always directly ended. What makes the story of Chernobyl so haunting isn't just the scale of the disaster, it's how ordinary the hours leading up to it were. A delayed test, a tired night shift, a handful of small decisions, each one explainable on its own, none of them seeming catastrophic in the moment. There was no single villain, no single moment of obvious recklessness. Just a chain of small, human choices, made under pressure in the dark, by people who had no idea they were about to trigger one of the defining disasters of the 20th century. Today, Chernobyl draws thousands of visitors a year, tourists walking through the same streets the residents of Pripyat once called home, photographing a Ferris wheel that was supposed to open on a holiday that never came. The plant itself is now sealed beneath a massive structure called the New Safe Confinement, built decades after the disaster to contain what remains of Reactor 4 for the next 100 years. Wildlife, strangely, has thrived in the absence of humans, with wolves, lynxes, and wild horses now roaming freely through a city built for people who can never come back. The story of that night in April 1986 isn't just a story about nuclear power. It's a story about how fragile our sense of control really is, and how a single decision, made under pressure at 1 o'clock in the morning, can change the course of history for generations to come. If this story kept you watching until the very end, subscribe, because next week we go inside another disaster that changed the world in a matter of hours.